Welcome to the Power Lunch on LinkedIn Live. This is Rhett. I'm Rhett Power, your host. We do this program Monday through Friday. Now it's sort of expanded into this 5 days a week. We try to get the program on about noon if the technology gods permit. And today they did not, so we will be doing it a little bit later in the afternoon. But we appreciate you joining us nonetheless. I know your time. We know your time is valuable, and that's why we bring you the best thought leaders, corporate CEOs, best-selling authors, people who are doing amazing work in the world to make it better. Our point of the show is to learn from those people. I think today we succeeded in bringing you somebody that we're going to learn a lot from. The fun part of the show is that it's interactive, so you have to ask questions for it to be that way. And so please do ask your questions. If we don't get to them on the program, we'll certainly get to them on social media after the program, and we'll certainly engage with you there. So please do ask those questions. It's really, really important. And we're simulcasting this program on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, and LinkedIn, all with the help of Social Live. Now, if you like or love the program, hope you love it, please give it a like or share so people in your network can benefit from these conversations. Now, again, I promise you that we are always going to try to bring you the best people to learn from. Today, we've done that. We've got Dr. Jeffrey Hull. He's an author, educator, and a consultant on high-performance leadership, change management, organizational strategy, and culture. He's a clinical instructor in psychology at Harvard Medical School, director of education and business development at the Institute of Coaching at the McLean Hospital, and professor of leadership at New York University. And he's got a new book that you have to read, and we're going to talk about that today. It's called Flex. It's in stores. Jeffrey, how are you?
I'm great. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Good. Thank you for joining us. I know you've been busy with the book activities and with all the stuff that you're working on. So your time is valuable, and I appreciate you coming on. You talk about in the book that we're in the age of sort of the post-heroic leader.
Right.
What does that mean?
Well, first of all, I have to say I did not coin that term. There's academics that are doing real research and theoretical studies of the lineage of leadership. And so I borrowed it from the academics. But I think it basically pinpoints a huge shift that's taking place on the landscape of leadership from what we would think of as the hero, the white knight, the guy, typically a guy, not always, but typically a guy that comes in and is going to rescue us all, has all the answers, the visionary. It's basically that individual, and that's really the key thing, the hero that leads us off into the sunset. And there's still going to be a role for that kind of leader, and we're always going to find that they will emerge at times, especially when there's like emergencies or a really difficult situation. But there's something else happening. And that I call post-heroic, which is really more about creating a leadership environment which is more inclusive, more participative, more democratic fundamentally, and less hierarchical. And so it's really more about a we style leader. And I'm seeing that just playing out all across many organizations that I work with. And what's poignant, I think, is that it's somewhat antithetical to what we see on the news every day and what we see maybe happening in a lot of countries around the world. So I thought it was really important to pinpoint that distinction so that people really see that there's a lot going on the ground.
Yeah. Do you think that there's a challenge? This is a little off topic, but do you think there are different challenges for older leaders versus younger leaders, or do you think that they sort of face the same challenges today? I mean, is it somebody my age harder to sort of adapt to sort of the changing landscape of work, or do you see the challenges as similar?
Because we're all dealing with this internet-driven, high-tech environment. I say in my book that we are all millennials, in a sense that all of us are dealing with social media. All of us are dealing with 24-hour workplace. All of us are dealing with virtual teams. So many of the fundamental shifts that are taking place in the organizational landscape are impacting all of us. that being said, there are definitely different perspectives. So, you know, if you're a boomer or a traditionalist and you've been working for 40 years and you worked your way up,
Yeah.
and now you have someone who's 28 years old who wants to directly communicate with the CEO, and it took you 10 years to communicate with the CEO, it can be frustrating to figure out how to lead those folks. Likewise, if you're the next generation of leader, and I talk about that a lot in my book, it can be frustrating to have to wait your turn, or to get involved with, to deal with hierarchy, or to hear about someone talk about seniority. You know, they say, oh, it's a merit-based system, but then you have to wait 3 years before you get promoted. And the millennials are like, no, I'm out of here.
I'm done.
Yeah, so I think it's both and. On the one hand, to your question, the landscape that we're all dealing with is the same, or the fundamental shifts that are taking place. How we work it as leaders is different from the different perspectives.
Do you think it's going to force that change that's coming? Do you think it's going to force different structures in corporate America or in business?
I think it already is. And I think those companies that decide to leverage the opportunity in the flatter, more networked, more interconnected world are going to do well, because they're going to figure out how to partner. You know, the companies that I've worked with and the leaders, and I write about this, that have been successful are the ones that learn how to partner millennials with boomers. You know, there's one example in my book where I talk about a company that has a reverse mentoring program, where they actually took the younger staff and made them the mentors of the senior staff.
Really? Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's a reverse mentoring, and it's working so well that I have another client that's considering experimenting with it. Now, some of the C-suite executives are a little like, whoa, what are you doing? You know, bringing in the youngsters. But here's the thing, the organizations are interested in using social media. They're interested in knowing how to work in a 24-hour connected workplace, and they're not always as savvy about the technology. So they can learn from the younger folks. Likewise, the young folks that get directly connected to senior people are thrilled because they learn so much, so fast. And there's a peripheral benefit, which is that those younger folks do learn to become more patient, because they begin to recognize what it takes to lead from the top with the big decisions, with some of the really complex issues. They get exposure to that. And then they calm down a little bit. They're a little more mature. So it's a win-win dynamic.
Well, they also get a champion in the organization too, right? They get to know somebody that can help them.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's just so many benefits. It does require the senior people, the folks that have been around a while, to be a bit humble.
That's hard.
That's not always easy. But when they see the benefits, and they see the fact that those younger folks are excited and engaged, and they're staying, you know, in terms of commitment, loyalty, then they usually, it's like, oh, I see. Okay, I get it.
Light bulb goes off. And
yeah, it's like, no, let's not only do this, let's promote it.
Right. Let's do this more. Let's
right.
engage this. Let's do this at all levels of the organization.
Right.
What is adaptive leadership?
Well, I just talked about, that's an example of it, right? You know, someone asked me on an interview the other day, is what you're writing about situational leadership like from the 1980s? And I said, yes, and it's a hyper situational leadership. You know, in the original work on situational leadership, which I respect greatly, it was all about that one individual reacting to a situation and deciding in the moment to delegate or to coach or to direct, all of which is still relevant. But the key phrase that I just used that's different today is in the moment. You have to be agile, literally granular, minute by minute, to be able to shift modalities, to be able to communicate in a way that's going to reach people, connect with them, and get the best out of everyone. And that requires a whole new level of agility. So that's what I mean by, I would call it almost like you have EQ, this is the AQ, the adaptive quotient.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And you talk about, in the book, you talk about beta leaders and alpha leaders. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because I find that fascinating. And actually having, be adaptive, right? that there are moments that call for one or the other.
Right. That's probably a key, that in fact is a key theme in my book, which is that once I recognized in my research and in working with other coaches and in looking at my own clients, that people tend to fall into a spectrum. They tend to be more alpha, rational, directive. They tend to be focused on being more authoritarian in their communication. They tend to be closed and conservative and stoic. That's a more alpha style. Right. Then there are those that are emerging on the scene that are maybe a little more introverted. They're consensus driven. They're more emotionally, they're more comfortable with feelings and intuition, and they're more transparent. They might be more willing to be vulnerable, but they're kind of at the other end of the spectrum.
Right.
And the bottom line is both are valuable, both are valid, and both can work. And the most effective leaders move back and forth depending upon the situation. But in order to be able to develop that kind of agility, you have to know where you're starting. You have to have self-reflection. You have to get feedback so that you can become aware of your style, and not to have a criticism of it, but to see it as a set of strengths that you can then expand. And that's fundamentally the theme of my book. If you're more beta, you want to move and develop your alpha skills.
How do you do that? Like, how do you get better at it?
Well, that's a really good question. I have a client right now.
It seems like it goes counter to your personality, right?
Yeah, I have a client who's an executive director of a nonprofit right here in New York who said that exact thing to me the other day. He said, Jeff, I'm really not very bossy. I like to sort of sit back and let my people do their thing. But then sometimes they complain that they don't have enough guidance. They don't get enough direction from me. And then, to his credit, he recognized that he had a tendency to swoop in at the end and be very directive at the very end. And that frustrates people. Like,
right.
Wait. So I said, well, okay, what does it feel like when you swoop in at the very end? And then he described a very alpha behavior. I go in, I get detailed, I look at what they did, I give them feedback. I'm like, well, why don't you just do a little more of that up front? I could do that. Okay. So in other words, he had that energy in him. He was just reluctant to use it.
And I bet it was frustrating for him too, right? Because he felt like he was coming in to clean up and put his foot down, which is, I see that, right?
Yep. And it works in the other direction too. So you have someone who's highly directive and tends to be very driven and very results oriented. And the people, he says, I want more creativity out of my team. And everybody's like, I'm scared. So that person has to learn to step back and become a better listener and be curious and ask open-ended questions and create an environment where people will bubble up ideas. And they also have to develop their beta style.
Are there some things that in your coaching that you do to help people sort of get in those habits? Are there any tips that you can give people? Because I know that there are people listening here right now that says, oh, that's me. I do that all the time.
Well, I think the most important thing is to step back and either assess yourself or get some feedback from those you trust, so that you kind of know your natural ground. What is your default tendency? And then ask yourself, what do I need to expand? What would be valuable for me to learn to do differently? And who can I look to? Look around and see how other people do it. Because it's from learning from others, and also a coach if you have one, but allow your lens to broaden to say, oh, the way I do it isn't necessarily the way everyone does it. What does Mary do it? She's down the hall. She runs the team very differently. What are those things? And just I ask my clients to become a detective.
I think I was talking to somebody a couple of days ago, and I really loved, having sort of an accountability partner in the office that can come to you after you've done something like that and say, hey, Rhett, you did that again. You might want to, just to remind of the behaviors that you want to work on and change.
Yeah.
Somebody that can call you on it maybe, but politely or sort of out of the situation.
Yeah, and in fact, that's when you create more of a partnership leadership style, right? Where you actually have buddies that you have, not only that you trust and you listen and you ask for confidential, real feedback, but you also work with them to complement your styles. My most successful clients will have a small cadre of leaders who exhibit various behaviors, and they can learn from each other, and then they can switch hit.
Right.
And over time, they then develop each other's capabilities, so they all expand.
It's kind of internal coaching in that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
You've got six in the book. You talk about 6 key elements that are essential in the workplace to succeed. Can you talk about those a little bit? That's a fundamental part of the book that I thought was really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, what I did is I basically tried to divide the key competencies of this adaptive leadership that I'm talking about in this new level of agility into categories, so that when you step back and you think about all the things you do as a leader, they do tend to fall into buckets. So the first one is about decision making, right? And that's where I called it flexibility in your decision making style. Are you, as we've talked about, are you directive or are you consensus driven? And the second one is about your communication style. So how do you communicate to your people? Are you always rational? Do you use the PowerPoints and have bullets and, you know, strategic plans, and all of which is great? But at the other end of the spectrum, we have communicators that are more storytellers. They use humor, they use metaphor, they have a vision, that they draw a picture. Right. And that can also be very powerful, especially for today's millennials. So intentional communication style is the second domain. And that's often an area that we get called in to coach on. Right. The third is your emotional bandwidth, your emotional intelligence. And this is obviously a topic that a lot of us are working on these days, is when and how to bring the emotional component into your leadership context. When to share your feelings, when to ask people how they're feeling. Some are going to be much less comfortable with that. Right. Right? And some are going to be maybe even overly effusive with emotions. But the emotional agility, the emotional component of leadership is really key. The next is the level of authenticity. You know, I call it realness for the sake of sort of the simple acronym that I created, but it's really about whether or not, on the one hand, you tend to be very stoic, lots of integrity, very strong and composed and conservative, or at the other end of the spectrum, you tend to be more transparent and open and humble and vulnerable. And people tend to feel comfortable in one end of the spectrum or the other, right? And we all know sort of those open style leaders. Sometimes they need to button up a bit, right? And you know the other end of the spectrum. So for someone who's kind of closed and very super confident, to become a little more vulnerable, a little more open. So authenticity. And then finally, your collaboration style. How do you collaborate with teams? Are you more directive? Mm-hmm. Are you more delegating, which is, you know, A, B, C, D, you do this, you do this, you do this. It's very important to do it at times, but the other end of the spectrum is more coaching and empowering and mentoring, which is really trying to set an environment where you get the most out of other people. Rather than you telling people what to do, you engage to get them to figure out what to do. And again, it's a spectrum. And then finally, the engagement environment. How do you engage the whole team? What is the energy of the environment you're creating with your group that you're leading? And they tend to also come in two flavors. One being very results oriented, very time dependent, and very structured. We all know those leaders that are to-do lists, right? You know, A, B, C, D, exactly. Results, which is great, except if you want creativity. Creativity is not a linear process. It's very fluid. It can be very messy. A lot of maverick type people, you know, they do their best creative thinking in the middle of the night, right? But the results oriented leader is going to have a hard time with that. So the other end of the spectrum is creating an environment that's more fluid and more flexible. And that's where you get an innovation environment. So those are the different categories that I focused on in the book.
Do you think that there's a difference? I think sometimes, I know in my coaching, there's a sort of this, we confuse emotional intelligence and authenticity. Do you think there's a difference?
I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I made a very clear distinction actually between the two of them, because authenticity is really about your value system, right? It has more, it connects more to integrity And it's about whether you tend to be kind of black and white about how things are right or wrong, or you're comfortable with gray. And that's where I think things like humility, vulnerability, stoicism at a kind of a spectrum, conservatism in terms of your beliefs, that's all in what I would call the domain of authenticity. Okay. And it bleeds into emotional intelligence, because there's an emotional component to almost everything. You know, you could say that all 6 of my categories have an emotional component. Absolutely. Right. Yeah. So in fact, sometimes emotional intelligence doesn't deserve to be in its own category. But there is a way in which, to be an effective leader, you need to think and reflect on how you work with your feelings and how you express, regulate, how you encourage others to express their feelings. That's a little bit different, I think, from a value-based authenticity lens. So that's why I think they're coupled together, but there's a distinction.
I do a lot of work in sort of diversity and inclusion, and what do you think? Because I often find too that there's sort of this misunderstanding of what inclusive really means. What do you think it means? How would you define it, and how do you look at it in your practice when you're working with leaders, or do you address it at all?
I do, absolutely, and I think it's a really rich subject that is going. You know, if I had to say what my next book is going to be on, it's probably going to be in that space.
Okay.
And I'm not saying that I'm necessarily an expert in it, but I do think, like you, it's challenging and it's interesting, and it's paradoxical, and that's what makes it very, very interesting. In that, from my standpoint, key components of inclusion or inclusivity are a sense of belonging and a sense of safety, psychological safety. And my colleague Amy Edmondson does a lot of work on that, and I love her work, and I reference it in my book. So what does it take to create an environment where people feel safe, and then they feel heard, and then they feel a sense of belonging? And that is how you create, it gets to that engagement component of my book. And it's different from diversity. I mean, diversity flows into it because it has to be a listening for different cultural, geographic, racial, gender backgrounds, right? But the paradox that I'm pointing to is you can also, and this is a whole different conversation, but you can also have too much belonging.
Okay.
And that's called a cult.
You're right. Yep. I see your point. I like it.
Yeah.
Right.
If you create an environment where everybody is singing the same song, guess what you got? A problem. Right?
Well, you start having groupthink, right? That's
exactly.
I mean, that's going to be a real problem in business. I mean, that'll kill you in a second.
Yeah. So inclusion is a really rich subject, because as an agile leader, you want to play that growth edge, creating an environment that welcomes, honors, and embraces the voices and the backgrounds of as many different people as possible. But it's not about getting them all to sing Kumbaya according to your version of Kumbaya, because that bleeds into something that's actually not. It's almost like too much inclusion. And the catch with that, and I'm being glib by saying cult, that's a really extreme version. No, but if you're overly, let's say you're in an organization and you're creating an inclusive team, you have to be careful that you don't create outsiders where people don't feel like they can penetrate. So ultimately what you want is inclusion, but you want to be porous. You want it to be, you want it to have openings to welcome the outsider and to allow your own people to step out. So that permeability of your inclusive team is really crucial to success.
Well, you want people to challenge. You want it to be an environment where people can challenge, right? And challenge the current thought. I mean, there is an edge there somewhere, right?
Absolutely, yeah. That's why it's such an interesting subject for many leaders to grapple with.
Yeah. Creating
enough safety so that people will do something that's unsafe.
And there's a lot of fascinating research about, diversity and inclusion, and about how, and there's a huge business case for creating this environment that we're talking about.
Absolutely.
It's the right thing to do, but it's also smart business. But it is fascinating and worth maybe another conversation. I'd love to talk to you about that one time.
I mean, I think the one takeaway that if you were to ask me about a tip for leaders or coaches that are watching this, is to have in their toolkit the phrase cultural humility. And the reason I say that is because as you look around the room in your team and you have more and more diversity, and you may be a more diverse leader yourself, you want to be aware of not knowing what you don't know.
Yeah.
And that's really key to today's success. As you said, it's a business, it's a leverage point for getting the best out of everyone. There was a time a few years ago when there was a phrase going around called cultural competence. Like, let's all try to understand the people from Thailand and the people from Korea and the people, and it's like, that's almost arrogant. Like, as if you're going to be able to understand Koreans and Thai and Vietnamese and Africans and Brazilians and Americans. No, it's not going to happen. So what I love today, there's some good research being done on cultural humility, which is about recognizing that you don't know, and then honoring and learning and creating a learning environment so that, as you said, if you have a team of people from all over the world, you can get the best out of all of those people.
Yeah, I mean, that's a challenge. But I think there's some real simple things you can do that honor culture and honor differences that aren't very complicated.
Right, and one of them is being humble.
Yeah, that's one of them. I had an interesting guest the other day who does dinners, corporate dinners, and they do it over meals. And I thought that was a fascinating way to build team, is to do it over food, right? And that you learn a lot about people just by eating and having a glass of wine.
Yeah, I have a client who has a virtual team, and she has people in 6 different countries. And one of the things that they do on a monthly basis is they have one of the members do a walkthrough of their house with a video.
Cool.
And so they show, what's your favorite room in your house? What is your kitchen? How do you set up your food? And it's like a show and tell.
Yeah.
And it's so wonderful learning for everyone, because the person in Amsterdam has like this tiny little kitchen, and the person in India has this open space with pillows, and they get to share. This is where my family comes together, and this is, and it's a great learning for everyone.
And well, what a way to that's a great tip. People should use that and steal it, because I think that's whole nother topic, right? How do we manage in a day where we're all spread out all over the world and we have remote people? I think that's a very fascinating topic. What do you think are your key takeaways? So I mean, we're gonna have to wrap up, but what are your key takeaways for the book, and what makes it different than all the other leadership books that are out there? Because there are a ton of them out there.
I know.
But I found this one to be really different, and I wanted to sort of get your thought on, because you had story. I mean, to me, the stories were the most powerful part of it. And so I guess what I'd ask is, what makes it different to you than other leadership books? And do you have any favorite stories out of the book that really touched you?
Well, I think the thing that makes my book somewhat unique, and I want to be careful because there are a lot of great books out there. So
sure.
But as I really tried to focus in on diverse leadership, like I tried to share some of the examples, not only of leaders who just don't follow the routine that we've been hearing about for the last 500 years, right? They're really doing it differently. They're bringing out their own voice, their own approach. And I wanted to honor that. So that, I think, is pretty rare. I'm sure it's not the only book where I share a lot of case studies of a very diverse population of leaders, and also cross-generational. Mm-hmm. So throughout my book, you'll find different industries, you'll find different age brackets, and you'll find a lot of diversity. And that's actually really who I work with these days. So that's number one thing that I wanted to do. There's so many great books written by the famous white male heroes, and they're great. I love them. I mean, I'm a big fan of Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and all those guys, but I wanted to write about what I work with every day, which is much more diverse. And then secondly, I wanted to highlight this theme that everyone has the potential to be a leader. You do not have to be a charismatic type A bulldog anymore to be a leader. You do not have to climb a corporate ladder anymore. From wherever you sit, from whoever you are, that leadership potential can come through in a whole range of ways. And I wanted to honor that. So those are probably the two big key distinctions, I would say, around my book. And I think that's to take advantage of what's happening in the world, right? We need to leverage all the leaders among us. And so I wanted to honor that.
Yeah, I like the point of that you can be a leader no matter who you are, no matter where you come from, no matter your background, no matter whether you're an introvert or an extrovert or your personality type, that you can actually grow into being a good leader, a great leader.
Yeah, and not only can you grow into one, you are one already.
True, right.
Like, you get out of bed in the morning, you're leading your day. So it's like owning it. Oh, I lead myself through my day. I lead my friends through difficult times. I lead my mom to whatever. Take the ownership that you're already leading wherever you are. And then a book like mine and a coaching approach, which is also the way I took the themes of the book, is you can coach yourself to step further into your leadership wherever you are in your career.
Yeah, that's fantastic. What's the best advice? This is the last question. What's the best advice you ever got, and who did you get it from?
Well, the best advice is always the most painful advice.
Fair enough.
I mean, because it's always in retrospect that you look back and you say, oh, I'm really glad someone told me that early on in my career. And I can remember, I'll give you a quick vignette. I was probably 23 and I had just graduated from college and I was in my first professional job and I was working as a recruiter in a human resource job. And here I am at HR, which is a people job, right? And my boss came up to me one day and he said to me, Jeff, the secretary is a human being. And I said, yeah, sure she is. I know she's, and he said, you're treating her condescendingly at times, telling her what to do and telling her to do this and this and this. And I'm 23. I thought, yeah, but isn't that what secretaries, they work for me. They're supposed to do what I tell them to do. And he goes, think about it. And then later on I went back to him and I said, I'm thinking about it. And I want to know what it is you really want me to get from this because I appreciate it. I was like, whoa. And he said, be nice to everyone, even the secretary. They can make or break your career. And I was like, oh my God, that is so true. And I've always remembered that, the receptionist, the person at the door, they can make or break your life. Be respectful, be nice, be kind. I'm not, I have my bad days, but
we all do.
But that was just so powerful. And I'm so grateful I got that feedback really early in my career.
No, that's great advice and so true. And a good life lesson in anything, right?
Yeah, thank God I got it when I was 24 instead of 40.
Well, the funny thing is, you never know who that person's going to be down the road, right? I mean, you never know how they can help or hurt, right?
Right. That was his point. That secretary could end up being the chief operating officer, and she could be your boss one day, and she's going to get retribution. So, the next time you ask for coffee, be polite. Tell her to get herself a coffee at the same time.
Yes, pay for it.
Exactly.
Well, this has been fantastic. And thank you guys for joining us on the Power Lunch. Hopefully this was worth your time. I know I learned a lot today, and we appreciate you spending your lunch hour, your time with us. And that's why we do the show. If you want to look at the schedule and find out who we have coming on in the next couple of days, got a great lineup. In 2 weeks, we're going to be in Albania. So we're going to be broadcasting from overseas. That's going to be a lot of fun. But anyway, you go to the website, powerlunch.live, powerlunch.live. You can see the show. We've started converting these episodes into podcasts, so you can get the podcast on the website now. And you can also go to see all the video shows on video via the website. And Jeffrey, thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. And best of luck with your show. I think it's awesome.
Well, thank you, and great book. Good luck with it. We'll put the links in the LinkedIn feed and on the Facebook feed to the book and to your website, and so that everybody out here in the audience can be in touch with your work and with you if they want some coaching or want to bring you on. I know you do some speaking and other things, so we'll connect people that way. And you guys have a great day, and we'll see you tomorrow.